So once again, welcome everyone. You are in the right place if you came for this session on revolutionizing sustainability, climate and equity planning, enabling municipalities to respond to complexity by transforming strategic management practices with Randy Saad of Refocus. I'm going to start with a land acknowledgement as always. So I am in Tiohtià:ke, colonially known as Montreal, which is the traditional and unceded territory of the Kanien'kehá:ka Mohawk peoples. I recognize that we're all calling in from different parts of the country today, so invite you to reflect on where you're calling in from, and in a moment invite you to share that if you wish in the chat. But it is Indigenous History Month currently, and we just had Indigenous Peoples Day this week. So we've been doing a lot of reflecting on the importance of accelerating progress towards reconciliation. And in the context of today's webinar, given the topic, thinking a lot about how we all as community change makers, including municipalities, can learn from Indigenous knowledge and teachings that really take a holistic approach to tackling environmental, social, economic challenges. And really don't see them in a kind of siloed way. So really what we're talking about today, kind of how do we break those silos? There's a lot we can learn from the Indigenous teachings. I'll just start by introducing our guest speaker today, Randy. So it seems like from the chat, at least one of our participants today is familiar with Randy and his work. Randy, I became familiar with Randy's work sometime last year, I think early on after I joined Tamarack. So, I forgot to introduce myself. I'm sorry. I'm Laura with Community Climate Transitions here at Tamarack. Totally just launched in there without starting with who I am. So when I joined Tamarack to launch this initiative around climate transitions, Randy shared his work with me, and it was really neat to learn more about it because here at Tamarack, we work with many municipalities across Canada that are trying to take climate action and promote environmental sustainability while also reducing poverty and increasing equity. And yet they really struggle to address these interconnected issues in a holistic way. So when I heard about Randy's work and the program he's developed, I just thought, yes, this could really benefit our members, and I'd love to share this with them. So we've been talking about doing this webinar for many months now, and it's exciting to have it come together today. So without further ado, I'm going to pass it over to you, Randy, to tell us more about your work, and let's get started.
Thanks so much for that introduction, Laura, and to both you and Jamie for facilitating. It's been a treat to sort of explore how we can collaborate and to have this opportunity come up. It's a real honor to be able to chat with so many of the people who participate in Tamarack's programming and are close to the organization, whether you're here live or following in the recording. Yeah, I guess I'll quickly share my screen and offer just a little bit of context to get started. Just a moment. Okay. So for today's session, what I wanted to quickly offer is just that I'd really like to try and keep as much time as possible for dialogue. And there's a lot for me to share and some complexity to what I hope to introduce. So my hope will be to keep to the minimum. You may see me referring to my notes, and that's part of me just making sure that I'm on track and keeping to the key messages and not getting off. And we'll have a couple of opportunities to discuss. So looking at our agenda, there we go. I'm going to start with an overview of the partnership we've created and the innovation that I'd like to talk to you about today. And we'll have about 10 minutes to discuss at the conclusion of that conversation. Then I'll talk a little bit about the work that we're doing with the City of Kitchener, as well as an opportunity to participate in the applied research partnership that I'll be sharing with you. And following that, we'll have the opportunity for a more fulsome discussion as well. Okay, so I want you to join me for a moment in reimagining government. I guess simply, I think it's clear many of our public institutions are struggling. We see things like diminishing public trust, demands for social justice, and a steady stream of global shocks that have really stretched government's ability to respond to the needs of our communities. The pandemic in particular has demonstrated that conventional governance systems aren't designed or adequately sophisticated for the complexity of the interconnected challenges that we see emerging globally. And unfortunately, already marginalized communities are also being disproportionately affected as a result. You may or may not be familiar with the donut economics model. I'm not going to explain it in detail. Feel free to look it up if you aren't. But what I would like to say is that essentially since 1970, humanity has increasingly exceeded the planet's carrying capacity, and all this while failing to meet or maintain, equitably maintain the well-being of a significant portion of our population. As mentioned, complex systemic challenges are emerging, and unfortunately within a government context, they're often addressed in silos, and many times on the periphery of the organization through sustainability, climate, and equity focused offices or planning processes. And really our view is that to move beyond the limitations of that approach and what may be really incremental change, we need to transform strategic management practices at the center of the organization. So thinking about capabilities, we'd assert that the current paradigm of management and governance systems that support planning, budgeting, and managing the operations of organizations were mainly designed from the past to optimize the delivery of city services. And what I would assert is that today's municipal operating system is being overwhelmed by the complexity of our rapidly changing world. We also see in the context of the issues that are emerging that local governments are evolving towards what I would describe as a higher purpose, focused more on enabling and empowering our communities. And I guess the gap is that ultimately there's a mismatch between the operating system and the futures that we're trying to create. And we would say that the outcome is that we need to transition towards more holistic, integrated, and equitable strategic management practices. But to this point, there's been a lack of market-ready and evidence-based solutions that municipal leaders can rely on. So I guess when we look at today's brand of financially oriented and relatively short-term focused strategic management methods and tools, they weren't really designed to match the complexity of the challenges and the interconnectedness of the challenges that we're trying to grapple with. And I think from our work and the partnerships we've developed, we see leading NGOs, academics, and experts alike really having emphasized the importance of innovation, and in particular, applying systems thinking in order to more effectively respond. What I'll introduce is this idea that there is a small and very powerful international community of scholars, innovators, and social entrepreneurs that has been developing what I describe as a new generation of knowledge methods and tools that combine leading management expertise with systems theory and the natural and social sciences. And we call these solutions systemic management innovations. So to make this idea of systemic management innovations more concrete, I'd like to walk you through a simple table that speaks to 3 areas of strategic management that would be affected as we look towards these solutions. So from a strategic planning perspective, and I mean, this is broad strokes and pretty general, so please don't take this as being a very definitive demonstration or a representation of exactly how things exist. Conventionally, strategic planning is a bounded process that produces a relatively static deliverable based on conditions at a point in time. A systemic approach to strategic planning would result in a continuous process that generates a dynamic deliverable that would be adapted in response to whatever comes up in terms of changing conditions. And the outcome is that we end up with a more adaptive organization that is responsive to change and innovative in nature. When we think about performance management as a strategic management focus, conventionally, performance management is led separately by each department and focused mainly at the center of the organization on financial considerations. When we look at a systemic approach, that would transition towards economic, social, and environmental trade-offs being accurately valued and in an integrated fashion. And the outcome of a systemic approach would be a more efficient and effective organization where available resources are optimally allocated across the organization and all of the objectives that it holds. From a stakeholder engagement perspective, conventionally, input is more transactionally solicited from a sample of the community that isn't truly representative of its diversity. And from a systemic standpoint, stakeholder engagement would look more like strong relationships being formed with a diversity of stakeholders who are meaningfully engaged through a participatory process. And the outcome would be a more resilient organization and community where stakeholders are empowered and they have their needs met. So moving right along, I want to share with you sort of how this applies in practice. And I guess I'll start by introducing a partnership we formed with the ICLEI World Secretariat and Veris, which is a research center at Wilfrid Laurier University. And it is focused on essentially capacitating local leaders to respond to increasing complexity. So MARC is the name of the partnership, and we are 3 partners in leading it forward. And the idea is that by leveraging systemic management innovations, and in particular, enterprise evolution, which is a programmatic solution, the program would essentially enable municipal leadership teams to select a combination of systemic management innovations and tools that match the unique profile, challenges, needs, and priorities. The program would also employ a highly collaborative and hands-on approach to ensure leadership teams are supported through the process of applying these innovations, these tools and methods in practice, and ultimately contributes to leaders learning through experience and developing both the capabilities and the confidence they need to continue applying these innovations independently on their own. To give you a bit of the backstory, Enterprise Evolution was originally developed in 2018 in partnership with a leading European NGO and was successfully scaled to support leadership teams of dozens of businesses at the time in the offshore drilling sector. In 2020, Refocus partnered with the city of Kitchener, and we are currently in the midst of a 2-year transformation program designed to apply a number of systemic management innovations with their senior leadership team and the rest of the organization. And I'll touch more on that a little later on. This eventually led to our partnership with Veris, who had been deeply involved in bringing an equity lens to climate action planning in Waterloo region. And they also sort of recognized that the answer to what is a deeply systemic challenge can't be addressed through a climate action planning process and requires fundamental change at the core of the organization. And we saw alignment in our ambitions and our approach. So we ended up building a partnership with dozens of municipalities and municipally focused NGOs, academics, representatives of equity-seeking groups, and people from my domain, which would be representatives of the innovation or management innovation community. And our goal is to apply and test enterprise evolution within the construct of an applied research program with 5 more Canadian municipalities. And we'll talk more about that opportunity shortly as it might be of relevance. Last slide, just before we get into some Q&A. In terms of the partnership, this is a quick or a high-level breakdown of what the Enterprise Evolution Program looks like in case you're interested. You can see there's 3 phases. The second phase is focused or blown up in the lower half. So the first phase is about establishing a mindset shift and helping leaders to see that the risk of continuing to use conventional management practices is actually greater than transitioning to more holistic and integrated systemic management innovations. And that happens through a multi-day set of workshops, usually with a senior leadership team. We move into a second phase where we actually adapt strategic management practices by applying systemic innovations. You can see that there are the different work streams we touched on earlier, and there would be a really integrated and collaborative process of co-learning and designing the program for the organization based on their needs and limitations, working hand in hand to implement those new practices, and then co-developing the sort of change that would need to happen thereafter in order to fully operationalize those innovations across the organization. And that becomes the focus of the third and final phase. So I'm going to pause there for a moment and give the group the opportunity to ask any questions about the partnership, about enterprise evolution itself, where it came from, me, what a systemic management innovation is. And maybe over to you, Laura, just to facilitate the selection of people who want to chime in.
Yeah, thanks, Randy. If anyone has a question would like to come off mute, please just go ahead. I know we're a relatively small group today, which is really nice. I'm
curious if anybody here is representing a municipality. how you might reflect on the idea that we're presenting, which might seem a little bit foreign or different, that we need to disrupt kind of core management practice at the center of the organization to enable the sorts of transformative change that we understand is necessary for the future. Does that resonate? Do you see that as a challenge? Are you feeling like that could be valuable for your organization as a possibility?
I don't know if you can see, I raised my hand, but I'll just lower it.
Oh, sorry, Sarah. I
That's
didn't
okay.
notice that. Yeah.
That's okay.
Go ahead.
I think this is like the big goal. And I think it should be, because that's what we're increasingly noticing, is that it's super cool to set up all these processes and these programs and these ideas and how we're doing things. But if they're not adapting to everything else, they're irrelevant, right? If it's not adapting for the people that are coming versus the people that are here, these processes don't really matter in the long term. So I think this is a huge conversation. So thank you for presenting today.
My pleasure, and I appreciate the comments. I think, not to just defer, but in the next section, I'll talk through a little bit of our practical experience with the City of Kitchener and engaging with their senior leadership teams, and some of the partnership we've developed in validating this idea and direction with a number of NGOs. And that might shed some light on, I guess, maybe the fact that this as a program and an approach is actually not pie in the sky. It may seem quite distant and of a different nature than most stuff in the sustainability space. But I think part of what is exciting is that we do have something that is tested, market ready, that is appealing to senior leaders, and it seems to be grabbing not only their intention, but their motivation to invest time and energy and resource into facilitating these sorts of transitions.
So just seeing, there's a couple things in the chat, Randy. So, well, Michelle shared that this is a challenge in an election year, which is a really important point. I know municipal elections happening in Ontario, BC, and elsewhere. Rena asked about, she'd love to hear more about phase 1 conversation with municipalities. How do you break down the need for change? And then Tara has a question, how do you establish relationships with municipalities and get to the point of being able to move forward with training? Oh, you're on mute.
I think I clicked the shortcut to mute myself by accident. So great question around phase 1, and I'm happy to elaborate and specifically speak a little bit to our experience with City of Kitchener in particular. So that will come just next, if we can pause on that. But in terms of establishing relationships with municipalities to get the point of being able to move forward with training, I mean, there isn't a simple or straightforward process. Part of our approach has been to firstly build partnerships with multinational and national NGOs like Tamarack that have an engaged audience of municipalities that are motivated to make change and to make a difference. And rather than trying to become experts in the municipal space, to work with those who are already experts and understand what's happening around training, learning, education, et cetera. So the partnership involves those organizations, and they're in part figuring it out for us. But in terms of the actual touch point, the nature of the dialogue that we've created comes from a strategic management perspective. And I think the nut that we've cracked is being able to help leaders appreciate and see very clearly how conventional management practice is generally designed around a relatively short-term, no limits to growth, financially oriented way of understanding and rationalizing the world. And even if that isn't super explicit or let's say the focal point in the way that it might have been historically, there is a lack of sophistication in the knowledge, tools, and methods that senior leaders are using to help them really grapple with and develop an integrated view of how all of the issues across the triple bottom line affect an organization. And I think what starts to become apparent is as we go through massive issues like the opioid crisis, like the affordable housing crisis we have right now, like the pandemic, so much is landing on the doorstep of municipalities. And my experience so far is when I have a dialogue conversation with a municipal leader, generally speaking, they're already very clear, they know over their heads, and they do not have the means to engage with the challenges they face and the limited resources that they continue to have, and to produce the kind of performance results that they have historically. And so there's a lot of questions and discomfort, and I think a general feeling of vulnerability. And I think the nature of the dialogue that we've designed is tapping into that and creating a space where seeing systemic management innovations, really represents a life preserver of sorts. So rather than being conflicted with a necessary change that's uncomfortable or unfamiliar, it's more like, oh my goodness, I needed this kind of stuff a long time ago, and tell me more. So that's been our experience. I can't say that we've talked to 100 municipalities, but in our initial work, that's sort of what's unfolded to date.
Great. Well, I think it'd be really neat to hear a bit more about the Kitchener example. I want to share a bit about that.
I will flip the slide over as much as there's not much to look at, and speak a little more informally about what has transpired between us. So in 2020, I had been in dialogue with a city councillor and the corporate sustainability officer. They both acknowledged that the city of Kitchener was moving towards the beginning of the process to develop its next strategy for 2023 to 2026. They felt that given where the person who leads that process was and the needs of the organization and some of the challenges they've had historically and the nature of enterprise evolution, that there might be a really good fit in thinking about applying it within the context of that strategic planning process. So we sat down, they quickly got it. This was March of 2020, and then the pandemic happened literally a week later. And so in the midst of all the firefighting and the crazy pandemic response that municipalities had to go through, somehow miraculously, the city councillor, the corporate sustainability officer, and the head of strategy convinced the corporate leadership team, which is made up of a CAO and 6 GMs, to engage in 3 half-day workshops focused on exploring this opportunity as the foundation for the development of the next strategic plan. And while working insane hours and being totally overwhelmed, they were convinced that they needed something new. And as much as this was a terrible time, it was as terrible time as it might be otherwise, because the next pandemic or the next disruption will clearly emerge from their perspective, and they opted to make that time available. And so to give you a quick breakdown of the experience, the workshop series we designed, and what I have to say is, there's nothing about enterprise evolution that is intended to be prescriptive. Certainly there is a general design and orientation, but enterprise evolution is really a container for leading conversations and facilitating an experience of applying systemic management innovations in practice. And so it's really on the organization to decide what their motivations are, where they need to go to work, what they're ultimately most motivated to do, and we respond to that. So in designing the session, we started with a couple of surveys which inquired about their experience with strategy development and pandemic response. It allowed us to open up a dialogue amongst themselves about their own experience of those aspects of the organization and what they felt the needs were. And in the wake of that need, and I mean, as I said, there's really no surprises about the experience that leaders are having given the complexity of the issues that are emerging. We then introduced some macro level or higher level systemic perspectives. Again, if you haven't heard of the donut before, the donut economics model, it's a really good example. So the donut economics model essentially applies the systems lens to how we understand macroeconomics. And it is a really brilliant and simple way of communicating the necessity and implications of applying a systems lens to how we understand the world. But really, it's at a global scale. It's not applicable at a municipal level, or at least it doesn't provide the sort of management discipline and the specific tools and methods that would be needed to understand how to practically apply that to the functions an organization performs. And so in the wake of that conversation, where our minds have sort of opened up to what a systems lens could look like, we begin an inquiry around how that might apply to the organization. And on the tail of that, we enter the group into an innovation lab. And again, we're at like hour 5 total of being with the group. And this innovation lab is a preconceived exercise where we had with, again, our team of the corporate sustainability officer and the head of strategic management, identified a particular area of interest, something that that was part of the previous strategy. And we gave the corporate leadership team the opportunity to essentially just experiment with a couple of systemic management innovations that would fit within the enterprise evolution model to see how they might apply to that particular interest. And based on that practical experience, they just have the opportunity to essentially see what a tool that is designed systemically and that is considerate of sciences might do in enabling them to make sense of the situation and ultimately lead to more confident and optimal decisions on how they might proceed, distribute resources, whatever the case may be. And so at the conclusion of that exercise, we then start dialoguing about the experience, what was learned, what was taken away. And the final workshop of the total of, whatever it is, 10, 11 hours that we had was dedicated to conceiving of the future. What could the roadmap look like? How could this fit? What's the comfort level? What questions do we have? And essentially over the course of, 3 half days, we created sort of buy-in and motivation to think about engaging in a large transformation program. And to be clear, just the design of what was next in terms of which systemic management innovations would we deploy and how would we work together, and how would those innovations be tailored to be applied as a first iteration for the purposes of learning, and so forth. That took well over a year. And of course, impeded by the pandemic, but it is a messy and very involving process. So I want to pause there just to allow us to go back to the question about engaging with senior leaders and how establishing the mindset shift or a mindset shift may work, and see if there's any follow-up questions or comments that anyone wants to make.
Thanks, Randy. Yeah, feel free to, I don't know if I'm missing the raise hand thing, but just come off mute if you like, or put anything in the chat. I'm curious, Randy, like what type of municipality are you looking for? What's the ideal profile?
Great question. And I think this is a good point to introduce some context on what enterprise evolution represents in the world and what our ambitions are for it. So the goal is not to create a whole bunch of intellectual property that as a consultancies or as a consultancy or the consultancies that co-developed it would hold. It's really to maximize impact. And so ultimately, our ambition is to scale the use of enterprise evolution globally. And of course, we don't have a team that could do that, but part of the reason why we've essentially encapsulated the program itself and the testing inside of an applied research partnership is so that we can build a clear business model and way of scaling. We can learn quickly about the development of this. And to your point, Laura, I think our interest is to have the opportunity to test enterprise evolution in very different contexts. And that could look like geographically across Canada or internationally. That could look like big and small municipalities. That could look like municipalities that are on the leading edge and those that are, considered well behind or just sort of getting started. The utility of the perspective, again, is about enabling better strategic management. It's not about specifically, climate action planning or a particular set of sustainability outcomes. So our view is that this is an enabling capability set and practical set of solutions that any municipality would benefit from in navigating the future. And so with that, part of what we need to learn is, while we have this great practical experience that we're developing with the City of Kitchener, we're not sure how applicable that is in different contexts. So we need lots more experience of working with cities of different sizes and in different places, et cetera, so that we can start to really conceive of what about the program can be generalized and maybe standardized so that we ensure that it is consistently and effectively applied, regardless of who applies it and where. What needs to be tailored and ultimately customized to the unique context in order for the program to be effective, because we don't want to generalize it to the point where stuff just doesn't make sense. And then hopefully with more of that knowledge and experience in hand, we can then develop a model along with the collective of multinational NGOs who we've engaged in terms of how we would deliver training and the means for many organizations to participate in facilitating enterprise evolution with municipalities in different places.
Great, thanks. There's a question from Rena about if you could share scenarios, what scenarios or questions were used by Kitchener in the Social Innovation Lab?
I'm not sure that I have, I will say, like, there's clearly a a boundary in terms of how much I can share about the specifics of client experience. And so just for the sake of being respectful of my client, I don't think I'm going to go into details of the specific issue or challenge that we discussed and how that conversation unfolded, as much as I would love to. And it might provide a whole other layer of appreciating the aha moment and how it landed. I just don't feel comfortable doing so. So I apologize, but I'm going to have to sort of balk at the question.
Okay.
I mean, we've touched on the partnership, so maybe what I'll do is quickly move forward here in the presentation. I want to start by peeling back. So I talked about the MARC partnership, which is kind of our global perspective and our work with the ICLEI World Secretariat. But before that, I mentioned what came was this Canadian sort of collective that we assembled, focused on getting 5 Canadian municipalities involved in a research program. So this is sort of the nest egg that grew into a global partnership. So the title of this project, which came from my colleague at Wilfrid Laurier University, and the Barris Institute, which I mentioned, Manuel Reimer, is Toward Equity and Accessibility in Municipal Climate Action Planning. That was the original focus. And what evolved through our collaboration was the path to enabling equity and accessibility in municipal climate action planning, which became by transforming strategic management practices at the center of the organization and thereby enabling the possibility of a transformation in how equity and accessibility might be reflected in many different areas of the organization, not limited to climate action planning. And so through what has been a 2-year process leading up to the submission of an application for a SSHRC partnership grant, this would be like a 5-year multi-million-dollar SSHRC application designed to allow us to bring applied research to the testing of enterprise evolution with 5 municipalities over multiple years. It ended up drawing some of the organizations that you see here. This is an exhaustive list. The list of municipalities here have all expressed interest and offered letters of support in terms of wanting to continue to explore the possibility of becoming case study participants. So aside from Kitchener, no other municipalities have been confirmed to date. You can see the list of NGOs here, which includes ICLEI Canada, Resilient Cities Network, Clean Air Partnership, Ziggy Foundation, and of course, the Federation of Canadian Municipalities. We continue to explore a multitude of different ways of collaborating with the FCM, given their future plans and trajectories and their recognition of this idea that some of the transformative change that we all want to see kind of requires disrupting management at the center of the organization. And you can see as well the list of academic institutions that are represented in the team that would be responsible for the research that would accompany our work. And so to get more deeply into that conversation about this TEAMCA project, which is the acronym, I thought I'd share just a little bit on what we're looking for in terms of municipal case study participants for what that's worth. So one, we're looking for municipalities that are prepared to engage a diversity of local actors, ones that are appreciative of the need to meaningfully engage with equity deserving communities, and are prepared to invest significantly and to make change around how that happens. We're looking for municipalities that are prepared to engage with, and by the time we get to commitment, have senior leaders in the organization committed to exploring how systems innovations can be applied to enhance management practices. As much as our starting point in many cases has been with climate and sustainability folks, ultimately to make the sort of strategic management level change that we're talking about, our understanding, our belief is that we need the most senior leaders in the organization to be participating and fully on side. And ultimately, we're looking for municipalities that have the capacity to invest financial and human resources. So what I'll say about that really quickly is that just like with Kitchener, our experience so far is that usually as a starting point, it makes sense to think about how this innovation or this program can be applied within a process that is being undertaken, whether it's developing a long-term community plan, a visioning process, a strategic planning process. Usually those processes involve hiring consultants, doing lots of facilitation and engagement and so forth. And so the idea of leveraging this program as a means for capacity building and advancing or elevating whatever process would traditionally be led tends to work synergistically and be much easier to envision being possible versus just doing something completely new and separate of the planning processes that are ongoing. And ultimately, we're looking for municipalities that are willing to participate in research activities. And by that, I mean, we expect to develop a peer group where the municipalities would have interaction and the opportunity to share learning and work together collaboratively. But as well, part of our interest is to understand the experience of municipalities, what's working, what's not working, what may be confusing or challenging, what limitations are affecting how much the program is making a difference or not, because that will ultimately inform our ability to evolve and improve the program. In terms of benefits, yeah, I mean, essentially you get a global all-star team of innovators, academics, and knowledge holders who will be deployed to supporting the application of enterprise evolution with municipalities that participated, including a curated set of leading innovations. The outcome of the program, again, is not like traditional management consulting or professional education. The goal is for us to help the leaders within the organization develop the capabilities they need to continue to further and further apply these innovations on their own in better responding to change. I mentioned the peer group, and then based on the municipal partners that we have secured, we essentially have access to a global network of thousands of municipalities. And what we're learning and ultimately the new knowledge that we're mobilizing as we go along would place the municipalities participating on quite the pedestal and give them exposure to a pretty large audience of municipalities and municipal actors globally. Just to give you a bit of the reality quotient, this is a quick set of timelines. So we submitted our first round Schnurr Partnership Grant application in February. And then the next step would really be, as we are right now, continuing to engage directly with municipal leaders and exploring the possibility of collaborating. What I'll say about that just quickly is that we understand this isn't, here's a 2-pager on a 2-year transformation program that we might have interest in participating in. Are we in or are we not? In our experience, this is a long process of getting to know one another, of substantiating the value of this, of building comfort and confidence, and ultimately figuring out how to stitch together the right opportunity for each municipality. And so we're very much prepared to engage in dialogue. I can't tell you how many times I met with the head of strategy and the head of sustainability at Kitchener in designing how we would pitch something to the corporate leadership team, and then actually designing the engagement that we led with them as a first step so that it landed, so that it was relevant, so that it considered their concerns, their situation. And so that's very much par for the course and what we expect to do. So if you have any feelings of hesitation, like, I don't know if this is going to work or what have you, the conversations are where we want to begin, and there's absolutely no harm in exploring. So yeah, we hope to begin securing more commitments from municipalities that want to be case study participants in our long-term study. And our final round Schnurr Partnership Grant application lands in November of 2022. We get notice about its success or failure in March of 2023. And we would expect to begin engagements between mid-23 and early 24. And when I say beginning engagements, that's beginning the process of designing what the heck we're going to do over the course of multiple years, which itself may take quite some time, as I mentioned from the Kitchener experience. So the real change and action taking, the participation in workshops and the application of innovations really may not begin until 2025 or later in 2024 for some municipalities. So, if you're feeling like, oh, there's no way we could jam this in the next year, this is really an opportunity to think about for 2 to 3 years down the road. And now is the time to, consider whether or not it could be useful for you on that trajectory. And of course, we can start earlier, but that's, I just wanted, in case there was any concerns about timelines being too fast, that we address those. So, I mean, that's essentially all I want to present forwardly. And now I really leave it to the group to ask any questions you have, either about the design of the EE program, Kitchener, the applied research aspect of things, the partnerships and collaborations we've established, the possibility of just joining the partnership itself if you're not with a municipality or you just want to learn and follow along. And of course, if you have questions specifically about becoming a case study participant. So I will now be quiet and hopefully we can take a few questions.
Thank you, Randy. And thanks for sharing the really concrete opportunity and a bit more details around the timeline and what this could mean for municipalities in particular. And we have a good mix of folks on the call today from municipalities and also from environmental organizations and networks and community nonprofits and so on. So there's a couple of additional questions and comments in the chat that have been coming in. So maybe we could go to those and we'll let people think about additional questions for the open dialogue. But so Rena had followed up about the Kitchener example and just asked if there were generally, if the scenarios questions were pulled from the existing plan or developed within the workshop, if you might be able to speak to that at all. And then Liza asks a question coming from the municipality, a larger municipality from Calgary in this case, whether it might be simpler to demonstrate strategic management on a smaller scale, like for example, 3 or 4 business units like climate, recreation, facilities management, procurement, and how this thinking can work on a smaller scale before thinking about changing the entire organization, the whole municipality.
Absolutely.
So those were a couple ones.
Really great thoughts. Thank you for sharing. So in talking a little bit more about Kitchener, I mean, the simple answer is we looked at the past strategic plan that was developed for, I guess it was 2019 to 2022. And we engaged in an exercise kind of looking at an aspect of that strategic plan. And the opportunity was to grapple with, which is something that we've talked to many leaders about, how organizations make explicit commitments to certain outcomes or objectives. So in the case of City of Kitchener, they published 5 strategic goal areas. So the question becomes, okay, so as a leader who is developing a strategic plan and ultimately having to make judgments on trade-offs between goals and actions related that might affect different strategic goal areas, how do you come to conclusion? You know, like what substance do you have for understanding based on a localized understanding of the thresholds or boundaries that exist, based on understanding what the needs of your community are? How do you understand the degree to which you're sustainable or not sustainable, and where the most important needs truly are? And then make value judgments based on specific impacts that can be anticipated and estimated that would contribute from adopting project to different aspects of what are the strategic priorities or strategic goal areas of the organization. And simply, inside of existing infrastructure, I haven't encountered a municipality that has the discipline or systems in place that would allow them to do that meaningfully, or at least in a way that would be comparable to how they do a financial analysis, for example. And so one of the systemic management innovations that we tend to rely on and use is called the multi-capital scorecard method. It essentially is designed by an expert in management accounting, was designed to completely align with the principles and tenets that underpin management accounting, and ultimately is intended to measure sustainability performance, not just directional kind of progress towards better impacts or lesser impacts. And it presents like a holistic and simple integrated view of how the organization or an area of the organization or an individual action may impact any number of key sustainability outcomes that are trying to be produced across the triple bottom line. And so, you know, in an exploration of that nature, we're able to bring forward an innovation like that and others that we can essentially have a group play with at a really high level. And it just creates the opportunity for them to start to visualize, one, how much of the decision-making and approach to management in general, and this is in any organization, really ends up being based on gut or a response to a number of inputs and something of an obligation, versus hard, useful, reliable information that's connected to the science-based definition of sustainability and the future that we want to create, not as a generic vision, but as a concrete understanding of how we could exist inside of planetary boundaries and while realizing the social foundations that are necessary to preserve the well-being of people. I know it's a complex answer. I hope that that's helpful more than it is confusing. I appreciate there's a lot more to dig in on, but at least as a starting point, I hope that made a difference.
Great. Yeah, that was clear for me anyway. Perhaps, Randy, do you think it might be useful if you stop the screen share and then we could just see everyone in gallery view?
Yeah,
okay, there we
Thanks
go. Thanks. I'm just personally going to switch it over to gallery just to see folks on the call. So
should I take the next question about
yeah, that's what I was going to go to. You saw it there, partnerships
Absolutely.
and collaboration. Yeah, and that's from Tara, who's a regional organizer in Atlantic with the community climate hubs.
Yeah, I mean, it's such a thoughtful suggestion, and I guess what I wanted to offer is that ultimately, I don't think we're ever going to be in a situation where a municipality says, hey, yeah, come in and we're just going to completely transform everything in the way we do things from top to bottom in the organization in one fell swoop. This is intended to be a long transition and a series of iterative transformations. So often the starting point is, what is the right scale? You know, in the case of City of Kitchener, it was the strategic planning process. So we're applying the innovations within the context of the strategic planning process. It is an application of innovations that touch all of the aspects of strategic management that we looked at previously, because all of them are really relevant to strategic planning. And the experience of doing that within the strategic planning process is going to give us the learning, the insight, and hopefully the buy-in and the confidence of the leadership team and others in the organization to think about scaling that application or implementation across the organization and as part of daily practice. So your idea that maybe a starting point would be to focus on several business units and the integration between them as a demonstrative kind of approach, especially in a very sophisticated large municipality, to me that makes perfect sense. I can't even imagine going into a city like Calgary or Toronto and thinking about applying enterprise evolution and relevant systemic management innovations right across the organization from day one. So really thoughtful comment, and I appreciate that.
Yeah, and sorry, before I was going already to Tara's, because forgetting about Liza's, because that, yeah, thanks for going back to that one. So the next one comes from Tara, who again is climate organizer outside of government in Atlantic region, and asked, well, one, expressed a lot of interest in this program and in joining the partnership and following along, and would like to hear a bit more about the opportunity for those outside of government to partner and collaborate with municipally focused NGOs.
Yeah, absolutely. And so at the conclusion of this call, Laura will invite everyone who's part of the call or watching the recording to share their contact and request essentially the opportunity to connect with me and my colleagues after this conversation. And the opportunity is twofold. So you can get more directly involved in some sort of capacity that may have you contributing to the project work that we hope to lead. But if your interest is really just to follow, to potentially provide insight, have updates, you know, understand what knowledge we're creating and what the outcomes of our testing and piloting happen to be, you can absolutely join the project from that perspective and have a much more limited role, but insight into what's happening. And we would certainly welcome that kind of interest.
Great, thank you. Feel free to use the raise hand function if you like, or just come off mute if you want to share.
I'm seeing Tara's question about our partnerships and collaboration with municipally focused NGOs. Mm-hmm. So the best example I can provide is probably our relationship with the ICLEI World Secretariat, which spawned from our collaboration with ICLEI Canada. So I started collaborating with their head of research and innovation. I guess it would be just over almost a year and a half ago. And I think the message that we've heard, and this has been, I don't want to say the same, but similar across municipally focused NGOs, is that they're appreciating our statement, as much as it may sound audacious, that essentially if we limit the focus of the problem solving to climate, sustainability, and equity focused offices and planning processes, we're going to be largely constrained or limited in what can be accomplished and stuck in the sort of incrementalism that we've seen over the past decade or two. That's not to say that we're not doing exceptional work and that people aren't leaders and doing really amazing things and innovating. It's just to say that the nature of the game is very much constrained by how the organization operates overall. So there's been an acceptance or a buy-in to this idea that we need to look at the center of the organization and adapt strategic management practices, and that starts with enabling a mindset shift and a recognition of what is kind of compromising the ability of government to adapt and respond to complexity, and establishing this as an opportunity. And as we've exposed those organizations to some of the systemic management innovations that are core to our community of practice and that are being applied in the field, there's been this recognition like, oh my goodness, these solutions are market ready and they've been out there and they've been tested in different contexts, and we desperately need them in the municipal space. You know, we want to participate in this. And we said, well, like, you know, our limitations are, one, we don't have a lot of credibility in municipalities already. We haven't been working in this space for a long time. We lack expertise around what municipalities really need and how we might scale something like this. And we don't have the platform to reach many municipalities quickly. And our goal is to scale impact. And so, of course, those municipalities, or sorry, those municipal NGOs who are interested in research and innovation and bringing new solutions to address the future needs of municipalities have said, well, this has been developed over the last 10, 15 years. And I'm not talking about enterprise evolution now, that's the programmatic kind of result of all of this, but all the systemic management innovations that my colleagues have been working on for a very long time, it doesn't make sense to try and replicate that. There's ready to go solutions that are credible and demonstrably successful that can be introduced to senior leaders. And if you have a way of talking to senior leaders that seems to establish some resonance and interest and continuing dialogue and making this level of change, like, yeah, let's work together and leverage the best of each other's strengths to try and amplify this and accelerate its development and the impact that it generates over time and see what happens. I hope that helps.
Great.
Well, on that note, Laura, I want to give you the opportunity to close the session. And I think you're aware I have to run to facilitate a 3 hours to do Kitchener session at 1 o'clock in my own Zoom room. So I just wanted to say a very, very sincere thank you. I'm so grateful to have this opportunity to speak with your membership and audience. And I really appreciate the partnership that you've lent to the work that we're doing. So thank you so much. It's been a pleasure to chat with some of you, and thanks for the thoughtful questions and comments. I hope you consider reaching out and sharing your contact with Laura. And I look forward to, if I haven't met you before, to speaking and meeting at some point in the future.
Thank you, Randy. Thanks for joining today. There's quite a bit of appreciation coming in the chat, and a question from Liza. How do we reach out to you? So if you could put your email address in the chat, that would be great. Sure. Mike from the City of London says you will be speaking with the Director on Strategy and Innovation, more to come. So this is great. And I would invite anyone who's interested in learning more and connecting with Randy, to feel free to send me a direct message now, just with your email address, and we'll just ensure that connection is made. So if you haven't already expressed interest in the chat for a follow-up. So yeah, just want to thank you all for being here. I'm going to quickly share my screen because I want to share a couple other webinars that are coming up soon. But yeah, just really excited about this project that Randy is working on, and I will certainly be following it in the months and years to come, since it sounds like you're in this for the long run. Yeah, and really excited to see how we can transform municipalities across Canada.
Thanks so much. Take care.
Thank you, Randy. So just a couple of upcoming webinars want to share with you. We have Failing Productively in Systems Change, Key Mindsets and Practices coming up in a couple of weeks. Youth Leading on Climate, Poverty and Affordability, and Sacred Civics, which is a great new book that I actually have right here, written by an ex-colleague of mine, co-edited Jane Engel and Tanya Chung Tiam Phuc. Really looking forward to that conversation. So hope you can join us for those. Otherwise, just want to thank you for being here, and you can reach out to me at Laura@Tamarack Community anytime. Really be happy to chat.